Okay, so week 4, we are still continuing to dive into the Victorian era. So this week we're going to be talking more about industrialism and the Victorian debate about gender. So in the readings this week, the first half focus on industrialization in England, and the second half, or actually more like these three at the bottom, focus on the Victorian debate about gender. So here are just some due dates to keep in mind. Reading commentaries due Wednesday at midnight. Comments to peers to be made Saturday at midnight, and the Victorian exam will be due next Tuesday at midnight. So a little bit more time on that. So on the syllabus it says Saturday, but I just decided to give you guys more time. It's going to be open book and open notes, which is why I'm suggesting that you take notes and review the information in week 3 and week 4 very carefully. So basically it's going to be on eCampus, short answer, some multiple choice, and obviously this is an English class, so you're going to have a bit of the long responses. So just expect that. It's going to be open book, like I said, so just take notes. And hint, look at things with asterisks next to them. Those are definitely going to appear on the exam. Also pay attention to bold, underlined, and italicized words in the PowerPoints. Okay, so this is just a review of the industrial age from last week. So we know it's the age of empire and imperialist expansion. It's generating a lot of income for England. And some of this is causing the workers to be full of stress and anxiety. So more people are being born in industrial towns, and industrialism made people's lives better at first because people are getting more money. There's a creation of the middle class. So basically, they're moving from an agrarian kind of lifestyle where everyone's working in the home, everyone's working in farms, or has some kind of trade that they're pretty much basing out of their house. But now industrialism is causing this huge expansion in factories, and the job market is just becoming more of a wide range. So it creates a middle class. So children in labor, so we're seeing some reforms on that as well. After years, the government finally sent in commissioners that are making changes. So a number of factory acts were passed regulating child labor, and it limited how long children could work. So they used to be working up to 16 hours in factories, which is almost unimaginable now. And then the Butler Education Act was passed, making school required. The Great Towns, which you are about to read. So he was one of the most influential persons of the 19th century for his work with Karl Marx on international socialism, which paved a way for future ideologies, which we've all learned about, and social interpretations, and his commentary and ideas on the life of downtrodden proletariat class and then industrializing cities of England and Europe. So, The Condition of the Working Class in England, one of the earliest masterpieces of urban sociopolitics, is a book documented by Engels on the social agony and horrors of working class during his 1842 to 44 stay in Manchester, which argued industrial revolution makes workers worse off. So his writing was eye-opening for readers, and it also triggered the quest of social equality, which later inspired Engels himself as a social investigations and studies for a secluded class of the city by intellectuals and organizations like Stephen Wheeler, Timothy Beatley, and World Commission on Environment and Development, an entire tradition of 20th century urban planning, capitalists and socialists alike. So he writes The Great Towns, which you guys should read about in the book. So London is an industrious city with little amounts of open country. He believes it lacks culture and tradition because of the emphasis on factories and capitalism. This occurs in other cities as well. The working class remains poor and suffers. Individuals of working class are not given time to be creative. Capitalism stunts creativity and suppresses rebellion. He thinks it causes individuals to be selfish and encourages them only to think of themselves. Everyone is exploiting their neighbor, and it produces social conflict and it destroys the sense of community. So, we know that the literature of this period has a focus on realism. In realist fiction, the purpose of art is to present an objective representation of real life, which reflects the daily habits, desires, and aspirations of the reader. Centered on the everyday experiences, moral progress, and inner struggles of the ordinary person, while showing the connection to this ordinary person's experiences to the broader world. Detailed descriptions of landscapes, cities, and domestic interiors. So, why realism? With the upheavals and revolutions of the 19th century, readers sought literature that repeated their lives and offered them moral and ethical guidance. So, there's a continued theme of aestheticism in the Victorian era. So, we see that continuation from the Romantic period. So it's a critique of moral purpose, of realistic fiction, and it's stressed experimentation in form and composition, independence in imagination and expression, and freedom of content, no matter how perverse. So some of the motifs that you would see were sunflowers, peacock, feathers, lilies, paisley, flowers, leaves, Japanese forms, insects, butterflies, and birds. And so the purpose was art for art's sake. And that's a quote that you guys should recognize. All right, so Victorian culture. Victorian culture was shaped by a sharp distinction between men and women, the male public sphere and the female private sphere. So it was the sexually active man and the sexually passive woman, all united in a belief in sexual restraint. So Victorians became known for being prudes. So Victorian was a common synonym for prudery well before the outbreak of the First World War. So this other cause in this sharp distinction is the change in who's allowed to vote. So in 1832, the Reform Bill extended the right to vote to all males owning property worth £10 or more. The 1867 Reform Bill extended the vote to all males. Women would not come until 1918. Okay, so this is a continued review from week 3. Oh, whoops. So there was a rise of secularism and religious skepticism. So the divinity of Jesus Christ, the literal truth of the Bible, man's creation, and the existence of God. So this is caused by evidence of the fossil record and theories of evolution and natural selection in Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species and the Descent of Man. And so there's another scientist, Thomas Henry Huxley, who coins the term agnostic in 1869, who neither believes nor disbelieves in the existence of God, holding instead it is simply possible for humans to possess the knowledge of such matters. So this is just continued. So in Britain's fast-growing urban society, the specter of overpopulation in general sense loomed large, with warnings of Thomas Malthus about the dire consequences of too many mouths to feed ringing in the ears of many. So there's growing pressures to have fewer children. The average number of children per household in the 1850s was 6 children. Even if 1 or 2 of them died in infancy, the burden on the Victorian mother was considerable. So there's obviously a lack of birth control in the Victorian period. So there's no contraceptive pill in this world at this time. Mechanical methods of contraception were ineffective and not widely available. The vulcanization of rubber in 1844 enabled the Goodyear Tire Company, that's right, a tire company, to produce rubber condoms from the mid-1850s. They were about the thickness of a bicycle inner tube, but they were expensive and still unreliable. Other methods of contraception, including withdrawal, promoted by the sex manuals, which were beginning to be published in the 1820s, were still unreliable. The only safe method was abstinence, and since it was women who bore the risk of pregnancy and the consequent burdens, which we'll talk a little bit more about, it was women who began to repress their sexual feelings. The idea that women were incapable of sexuality, an idea that would have seemed very strange in the Romantic era, became more common and was reinforced by growing male dominance within the middle class. The patriarch of the family demanded deference and modesty from his wife and daughters, who feared they might who feared that they might undermine his authority, and if they flirted with other men or displayed sexual knowledge. That's a big problem for the patriarch, because daughters had to remain chaste until marriage, or maybe it's chaste because of chastity. For an unwanted pregnancy could ruin a family's reputation and impose undesirable financial burdens, because basically they're just marrying their daughter off so they don't have to feed her anymore. And they're then given probably a pretty hefty dowry in return for her marriage. So, society, values, and culture. So, domesticity. The home and family is the center of British religious, cultural, and emotional life. Industrialization transforms the household from a workspace into its opposite, which reinforces prescribed gender roles. So, as opposed to everyone working in this agrarian society, kind of together because the women and men are both doing chores, it creates this middle class. So, all the husbands have their work and their roles in the public sphere, which, is going out and about the town, etc. And the women are expected to still stay home. So they become the caretaker and spiritual guide for the family in the private sphere of the home. So the middle class lifestyle becomes the ideal to which all aspired. It's basically the American dream. It would probably be called the Victorian dream. So working class women still worked, though. So probably like washers, maids, etc. Gender and sexuality. So, based on a middle class lifestyle, the woman's role is to be an icon for femininity or an angel in the house. So they have good manners, restraint, moral uprightness, purity, devotion, and selflessness. It kind of reminds me of Pamela, which I'm not sure if anyone has read. It's one of the first novels. Coventry Patmore's long poem, The Angel in the House, which is what I was referring to above, was written in the late 1850s, and they put it, whose youth is lighted from above, where through the senses' silvery haze dawns the veiled moon of nuptial love. Who is the happy husband? He who, scanning his unwedded life, thanks heaven with conscience free, 'twas faithful to his future wife. So women's rights, or lack thereof, I should say. So they're not eligible for most employment, and they're not eligible for higher education, and they still cannot vote. So women, and above all mothers, were the objects of sentimental idealization in Victorian literature and poetry. So the law at this time was that the husband and wife were considered one person. So here is the husband's rights. So he has full control of his wife's personal property and income, absolute authority over the home and children, could use force to discipline the family, and if deserted by wife, she could not sue for divorce and had no rights to custody of the children. So the illegitimate birth rate actually does fall in the 1840s. So women were having less sex outside of marriage, but what about men? So the Victorian home and sex. In the Victorian home, swarming with children, sex was a secret. For the sexual act was associated by wives only with a duty, and by most husbands with a necessary, if pleasurable, yielding to one's baser nature. The silence which first aroused in the child a vague sense of shame was in fact a reflection of parental shame. So here's a little bit more about sex. So fidelity within marriage. Houghton notes, was the supreme virtue, and sexual irregularity the blackest of sins. Adultery, especially in the case of the wife, no matter what the extenuating circumstances, was spoken of with horror. So a feeble and erring woman became, in fact, a societal outcast. So the fallen woman, so here's that term again, any form of female sexual experience deemed improper or immoral. So prostitutes, even rape victims, unmarried mothers, adulteresses, homeless women, the insane and rebellious women. So they're all ostracized from society and suffer poverty and death. So here's more about gender and sexuality. So Victorian gentlemen are noted to be tender, merciful, prudent, patient, and disciplined. So manliness became a way of controlling feral forces and base instincts of maleness. So Victorians invent modern sports which are played in public schools. So manliness is expressed not only in that way to let out that aggression, but manliness is also expressed physically in the form of beards and mustaches, which characterized virtually to all great Victorians, including Alfred Lord Tennyson and Prime Minister Lord Salisbury. So gender and sexuality continued. So the new woman doesn't come until the late 1880s and 1890s. She's smoking, swearing, riding a bike, debating in public, wearing man's clothing, and refusing marriage. She's a figure of greater sexual, social, and economic dependence. But she doesn't come until basically modernism. So in the 1890s, women experienced greater access to education, employment, political and legal rights, and civic visibility. Remember that the Victorian era ends in 1900. So, this is just a little bit more about the poem, and if you don't have access to it, it's right here. It might be a little small, this picture over here. But so it proposes an argument. So God's power is in the world, line 1. Like this light off the foil reflects everywhere. As you crush the olive, oil oozes out, and if you were to crush the world, God's grandeur would ooze out. So you have to see the awesomeness of God is basically what I'm pretty sure this poem is saying. So, the poem is right here. I'm not going to read it all for you because that would make this video so much longer. So basically I think it's also saying, why do men not pay attention? Why do they just destroy the world with industrialization? Despite all this, nature is not completely destroyed because God's grandeur is right in the heart of nature. So, My Last Duchess. I think you guys will enjoy reading this poem. It's a little long, but I still feel like it's pretty relevant. Hint, hint. So, the last Duchess was murdered for her kindness. So, it's arguing against the societal norm that Victorian men want a woman who is restrained and kind and quiet and obedient. So that's basically what the first Duchess was, right? Which the Duke then has murdered. So it's an example of the dramatic monologue. Hint, hint, also important. So it takes place in the Duke's castle. So basically, the Duke wants another wife because he just murdered his last one because she was too perfect. Oh, that's just such a problem for him. So he is talking to this marriage advisor slash count about dowry and whatnot. And at the beginning, he's kind of talking about the last Duchess, smiling on the wall, like how nice and stuff that she is. And then we end up finding out the whole situation. So, yeah, he basically had her executed. And now he wants another wife. I don't really feel like that's fair, but, that wasn't the way of the world then. So the Goblin Market. So this is a critique of the patriarch society of the Victorian era. So the feminist perspective of reading the poem could read, there is no friend like another woman. In another woman's arms, you can find comfort and security. So they have an intense friendship, but they also have a sexual relationship as well. So another reading also offers this self-sacrifice kind of vibe. But what do you make of the poem and why? So that's a question you can expect to see on your exam. So here's more about the Victorians and homosexuality. So they were more willing to accept the reality of two men engaging in a consensual sexual relationship than the idea of two women. And I remember actually reading that they could see like the physical logic of two men being together, but they couldn't understand how two women could be together. So basically, they were like, oh, well, men can actually have sex with another man, but a woman can't actually have sex with another woman. So that's kind of the way they saw it. So they didn't really, believe or support kind of the idea of two women being in a relationship. So I also have these articles posted to eCampus. You guys, I'm gonna click on this one, but you guys can read this one as well. All right, so, oh yeah, so, um, Oscar Wilde, he was the one who said art for the purpose of art. So the Victorian attitudes towards sex in general were, as might be expected, extremely complex. The findings of my sample survey of men prosecuted for having sex with other men, so he does this, he finds out, how many individual cases there were, but basically, uh, okay, so the double standards. So there were also practical exceptions of the British state's apparent prudishness when it came to sex. The criminalization of commercial male female sex only applied to women. For instance, men were not punished. The sexual demands of military were also privileged above any ideology regarding sex. The British Parliament and government had few problems agreeing to Contagious Diseases Acts 1864, which allowed police officers to arrest prostitutes in certain ports and army towns, and which allowed the women to be subjected to compulsory checks for venereal disease. Um, and, they raided, brothels and all of that. So when they might appear tolerant, this was also because they held no strong views about a subject they might observe but were not educated about, nor had any language to discuss. So, in conclusion, they suggest the Victorians were more tolerant than their 1960s counterparts of sex between males, but given the strict policing of knowledge and even the language used to discuss such intimate behaviors, we must ask, what did the tolerance really mean? Okay, so here are just some other sources that I used, which you guys can click on. And I will post these to eCampus as well. Alright, so hopefully I wasn't talking for so long and you couldn't hear me like swallowing or anything, but that's just some stuff that you can plan to see on the exam. And I am always available if anyone has any questions, just email me.